Sepia, played by Hannah Mangan Lawrence. Then, 20. Now, 34. Tiberius, played by Christian Antidormi. Then, 19. Now, 34. Leda, played by Anna Hutchison. Then, 25. Now, 39. Spartacus, played by Andy Whitfield. Then, passed away in 2011 at age 39. Sura, played by Aaron Cummings. Then, 33. Now, 47. Enemouse, played by Peter Mensah. Then, 51. Now, 66. Gaius Julius Caesar, played by Todd Lazance. Then, 26. Now, 40. Agron, played by Dan Feuerriegel. Then, 29. Now, 44. Mira, played by Katrina Law. Then, 25. Now, 40. Sybil, played by Gwendolyn Taylor. Then, 24. Now, 39. Naivia, played by Cynthia Addai Robinson. Then, 26. Now, 40. Ashur, played by Nick E. Tarabay. Then, 35. Now, 50. Nasir, played by Panna Hema Taylor. Then, 22. Now, 37. Crixus, played by Manu Bennett. Then, 41. Now, 56. Kore, played by Jenna Lind. Then, 26. Now, 41. Gannicus, played by Dustin Clare. Then, 29. Now, 44. Glaber, played by Craig Parker. Then, 40. Now, 55. Vero, played by Jai Courtney. Then, 24. Now, 40. Lucretia, played by Lucy Lawless. Then, 42. Now, 58. Spartacus, played by Liam McIntyre. Then, 28. Now, 43. Lentulus Batiatus, played by John Hannah. Then, 48. Now, 64.